Welcome to another episode of Heated Conversations. Thank you again for tuning into another episode. Super excited. We have Nick Ruddock, who also has Nick Ruddock Gymnastics online, as well as Nick Ruddock Masterclasses, where he teaches coaches and develops coaches on how to teach gymnastics really from the ground up. And he teaches a lot of high level gymnastics over in the UK. And I'm super excited that he took time to be able to join us on the podcast. To be able to talk about some of these things. Today, we're going to talk about running approaches for vault and floor and ways to be able to improve those, or even just different running techniques for different type of vault or even different types of tumbling. So thank you for tuning in. Remember to hit the subscribe button, to share, leave a like and a comment, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the new episodes. Let's welcome Nick to the podcast. Nick, thank you for joining the podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, and thank you for taking time. I know right now it's afternoon, it's morning here in the United States, and to kind of join this podcast and talk. This is the first time you and I have really met or had conversations, and I've watched a lot of your stuff on YouTube, on Facebook, and kind of following your journey and your just kind of techniques and stuff like that. And so I thought, where there's certain areas for me that are really passionate, that I would like to help the sport, having someone who's kind of doing this, and even if it's different approaches being in a different country and stuff like that. And we'll kind of dive into that. But before we do, I have two questions for you. My first question is, if you could have anybody in the world cook you any meal, what would you have them cook you, and who would you have cook that meal?
If anyone in the world cook me a meal, and what would they cook me? Okay. Well, I'm not going to go for a celebrity. I'm going to go for my late grandfather, actually. And the reason is that now that I'm a little bit older, I would probably just like to have a mature conversation with him and learn more about his life. And I knew a little bit about him, but I'd like to learn more. So I'd say that yeah, my late grandfather Henry, that would be phenomenal. And he did used to cook a very nice kind of traditional roast dinner. So it will be a roast dinner with my grandfather Henry.
And what things do you know about your grandfather, and what interactions do you already have with him that are really special to you?
Yeah, great question. It brings back a lot of fond memories, actually. I spent a lot of time with him. When I was growing up, he lived on a riding stables in a big farmland. So I used to go and spend quite a lot of time with him in the summer, looking after the horses. He's got an interesting story. He was a champion boxer in the British Army. He was a very he ran a very successful marketing agency in the 60s and the 70s. So he met Henry Ford and did work for Ford that were one of his clients. And he did a lot of exciting events for them, releasing and launching sort of the new cars back then. And so, a really interesting guy with a lot of stories to tell, whether that was from the army or his world in kind of entrepreneurship and business.
Yeah.
And I think it would just be fascinating for me to tap into that a little bit more now that I'm an adult, as opposed to just when I used to spend time with him as a child.
Right. No, that's good. Sorry, I have my
Oh,
little
hey,
here.
no apology needed. Who's this?
This is my 16-month-old daughter, Naraya.
Wow,
Yeah, so she's hanging out with dad today. So
very cool.
sometimes she makes her guest appearances on the podcast.
She likes the microphone, huh?
Yeah, she does. She does. Anything that she can get her hands on, she likes. All right, that leads me to my second question. So, if you could see anybody live in concert, dead or alive, who would you go see and who would you take with you?
Okay, so a few years ago, there was a really exclusive opportunity to see Alicia Keys in concert in a really kind of small, intimate environment in London. And there was very few tickets available. And I'd messaged my dad and I said, Dad, I really want to grab these tickets. So you're going to be available? And he took a little bit too long to get back to me. So by the time he responded, those tickets had gone. And it's a big regret for me because both myself and my father both, enjoy listening to Alicia Keys. But I thought that would have been a really really cool moment for us both together. And yeah, I guess if I had the opportunity to see anyone with anyone, I think going to that concert with my dad would be a good way of redeeming our kind of previous failing of getting any tickets. So
Yeah, and you have mentioned two male figures that have been really important to you, your
yeah.
grandfather and your father. And can you kind of talk about how your father has been quite that influence? And are you guys big music fans, and listen to a lot of music together?
Actually, we don't usually kind of I wouldn't say that we're both big into music in general, and we certainly don't do that collaboratively together. But I think that's what makes it special, having those experiences, whether it was with my mum or my father, just kind of doing something a little bit different. I think that's what makes those moments special and memorable, is when you get those opportunities to kind of step outside of normal routine.
Yeah. And I like your choice in Alicia Keys because myself, I'm a big Alicia Keys fan,
That nice.
and I remember growing up as a kid to her music and just kind of I loved her personality. I loved, you know, at the time when she was growing up, in the or as I was growing up, she was one of the ones, not saying that artists aren't respectful, but she was super respectful in her music and her
Sure.
performance and her appearance and everything like that. And so, as a when you're kind of thinking of a role model like female, that's kind of what I thought about. And her music just sounded great. And so,
Yeah.
having an opportunity to see her would be really cool. And I hope for you eventually get to see her in concert if you haven't yet.
Yeah, that'll be cool for sure.
Now, kind of before we get into our topics, I want
Mm.
to kind of dive into your personal journey a little bit. Kind of talk to the listeners, the viewers about who is Nick and how did you get to the point that you're at now, and what was your journey as a child? Were you into gymnastics? Were you into different things? And then when did you transition to becoming a coach and doing what you do now with Nick Ruddock Masterclass?
Yeah, so I think I had a pretty typical involvement in gymnastics from a young age. I would have been sort of 6 years old, I think 7 years old when I started. And I did recreational gymnastics. That's all I did throughout the entirety of, I mean, I can't call it a gymnastics career. I was basically a gymnast for 10 years. But I did it a maximum of 2 hours a week, and that was it, which is, quite unique really for people that are involved with performance gymnastics. I think most of them come from a higher level of competitive background. But um, put simply, I wasn't very good. I had my limits with regards to what I was capable of doing, and I wasn't a talented gymnast, but it was the 1 or 2 hours of my week which I looked forward to the most. And that's what was important to me. And transitioned from participating in gymnastics to then doing a little bit of coaching, a few hours a week. And that's when I really kind of, I guess, started to obsess over gymnastics then, because I was just in the gym all the time coaching. A lot of it was paid work, some of it was voluntary, and it went from there really. And after I guess maybe 12 months, 18 months, someone thought, okay, this guy might have a little bit of potential to work with our competitive squads. And I was really fortunate enough to be mentored by some coaches within that club. And this was kind of the same time I was at college, still studying. And eventually, kind of gymnastics just took over. Like I knew at that point, even though I was studying, that I was, going to be a full-time gymnastics coach, and that was that. And after a period of time, it was around the period of the Olympics in 2004. I was really inspired by what the US team actually did in Athens. So that was my first Olympics. Watching that as a spectator. Previous Olympics like Sydney, I had no interaction with that whatsoever. But Athens was the first one. And I remember, watching Carly Patterson and Courtney Coupettes and Terran and those gymnasts, just I was just amazed with what they did, and I was really inspired by it. And so I felt, why can't I go to America to learn what it takes to be a gymnast and of course a coach at this level? And I spent a couple of hours on Google researching, trying to get the email addresses of coaches that ran those clubs, and I guess through correspondence with a few people, I got quite lucky. My email request got forwarded to all the coaches in the US that had kids on the national team at the time, and for a 17-year-old, that's a pretty fortunate position to be in. And I was simply asking, can I come and learn? I don't need to be paid. It's self-funded. I just want to learn. That's all I need to do. I'll stay out your way. And so, a few people responded to that, and I was fortunate enough to take the opportunity to go to the US. I went to Gage. That was the first club that I went to, and spent a month there. And that month changed the rest of my life. Literally, in terms of being inspired, in terms of a very steep learning curve, having a going in without the understanding of what performance gymnastics really is, and having your eyes kind of opened up to a whole new world, as soon as you walk into those doors and you see, well, actually, this is, gymnastics is a big community, and I'm in just one club within a huge country, within a huge world of gymnastics. And that's I guess where my performance gymnastics kind of journey began. That now I was really addicted and hooked onto, what this meant, what this could look like for me as a career. And I guess, going back to the UK, continuing the work that I was doing at club level, going back to America, going to other clubs as well. So now I was going from Gage for a month to Woga for a month, coming back to the UK. And that was really rich experience for me. And as I mentioned before, changed the course of my life. So I guess fast forward on from there, you bouncing around a couple of different clubs in the UK, and then I was fortunate enough to be offered the national coaching position in Great Britain as a national junior coach, which I took for 4 years. And then once I felt that was enough, moving back into a club environment for a year, and then I made the decision to start my own business, which is Nick Ruddock Gymnastics. And since then, I've been, really fortunate, privileged to work with 25 federations around the world. So, supporting the athletes of the Canadian team, the Brazilian team, Australia, Germany, 25 different countries there. And not only going from a consultancy perspective, so helping the athletes and the coaches, but running events like the masterclasses, running a membership community now, which serves 59 countries around the world. And my focus is almost entirely on coach education. So, I'm still doing some consultancy work for some high-level athletes, of course, on the lead up to Paris. But most of my passion now, certainly my day-to-day activity is really helping to, coaches to soften the learning curve of gymnastics, because it's a really, as you know, it's complex. There's so much to learn. It's not necessarily that anything within it is difficult to learn, but there's just so many things to learn, and it's very overwhelming and confusing. And my work gives me a lot of pleasure. I think it has an impact on the gymnastics community, which is important to me, and it allows me to I kind of pass the baton, I guess, with the fact that there was coaches on my journey that really helped me without wanting anything back in return, and that changed my life. And if I can do that for other coaches now as well, then I'm kind of repaying that and paying that forwards to the next generation of coaches too. So here we are now. Yeah.
And that's really cool because one of the things I think about, because sometimes when coaches come from different countries, either Europe or come from Asia, a lot of times they had to go through like a formal like education system to become a coach, right? It was like part of like schooling for them to they have to go to university to be a coach. Where here in the US, a majority of the time you don't. You could just have a passion for it, work for your
Yeah.
club, and then you kind of build it into a career, and you can be very good without getting a college degree in it. Now, is that similar in the UK where you it's one of those positions for you to really be a coach, or even just at the national level, you have to have a degree, or kind of like what you're talking about, where you had the experience of coming to the States and learning from some of the coaches that were of those athletes of the either Olympic teams or national teams, and kind of was able to translate that into doing coaching in the UK. Is it a mixture of both, or is it just one or the other?
Yeah, it probably sits somewhere in between. So you've got your experiential learning, which is the stuff that I just encourage coaches to do all the time. Get out to other environments, go and travel to other countries. And that's optional. You can choose to do that, or you can not do that. We don't, it's not an obligation in the UK for you to have gone to college or university or to take a degree. So I would say that's at the other extreme end of the spectrum, which, some nations within Europe, but do ask for. I guess we're somewhere in the middle in that there are qualifications which are specific to coaching gymnastics, which coaches should take in the UK. Um, and we've got a couple of different governing bodies now, but they all offer a qualification structure. And British Gymnastics, which is certainly the largest governing body and the one that would manage kind of competitive pathways mostly in the UK, you've got pretty much a 5-step qualification process. And if you want to be teaching gymnastics, even part-time, you need to have taken those courses and qualifications. But they range from a few weekends a year to a couple of weeks of intensive learning and a combination of theory and practical exams. So it's not anything anywhere near as close to a degree, but there is an investment of time, there's an investment of money still, and studying research that needs to be done.
And in coming to the US and learning from these different coaches, you went to, you know, obviously a lot of gyms have different styles,
Yeah,
different styles of how they train, develop, in what I've seen from Gage, I haven't had my own personal interactions, but what I've seen online is, it seems as though at least in the developmental stages, there's a lot of play, meaning you
sure.
kind of play with skills and then it kind of turns into development into really learning the skills, but allowing them to kind of play around and kind of figure out their body and figure out how things work and not necessarily initially get super technical in regards to just like the scientific aspect of it, right? But kind of allowing it just to be something where they do play where woga, they're probably a little bit more technical from what I've seen. Again, I haven't been in their gym, but being
Yeah,
residing in Texas um and seeing them all the time and having friends who coach there, can you kind of talk about some of the things that you learned from
yeah.
each of those places that really shaped your coaching style now?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting observation, and I think it's definitely an accurate one in the sense of they are different environments. They've got different systems, different structures to them. That was part of the beauty, I think, of me being able to go to those two, kind of differing styles of gyms early on in my coaching career, because what it allowed me to know and learn is that there are more than one way of doing something. So yeah, you're right. One of the Gage philosophies is very much about play. Freedom to play, experimenting, planting seeds very early on with skills that the athletes are going to learn in the future. And you'll see that through their content and Al's content that he puts on Instagram and things. You can see the way that things are taught. Woga, you're right, it's very systematic. There might be more precision in what the athletes are performing at a younger age, for example. But I guess I had made the mistake of thinking at one point that the play side is less technical. And actually, it's not less technical at all. It's just a different pathway to get to that technical stage. We've got to look at skill acquisition as being something that happens over a long period of time. And so sometimes when we see something, we might make the assumption, oh, it's not very technical. But what we're seeing there is an early stage of that skills development, and it might not come to fruition until later. But when it does, it's just as technical. And I made the assumption once of looking at it and going, well, this isn't as precise. Maybe it should be more precise, but it shouldn't. And I think that's really the power of me going to two different environments, because I could say I'd learned probably more about methodology and drills and that creative freedom at Gage. And this was just my experience. And we're talking quite a long time ago now. And Woga, I really learned about technique. It was such a perfect environment for me to understand the minute details and why some of those details are important. And I do believe that me being able to blend those two schools of thought together, or those different approaches, or at least my different experiences together, probably helped me to become a more holistic coach,
Yeah.
and also allowed me to interrogate my own thinking. We fall in love with our own ideas as coaches. We can often do that, and this is particularly true for people that spend a lot of time in their own four walls. which is typical for gymnastics coaches. They'll go to the
Yeah.
same club and they'll work there 6 days a week, and they don't get time to go elsewhere. And as a result of that, we get stale. We fall in love with our methods, and we kind of forget that there's so many other ways of doing things. And so, when you get exposed to, let's say, we'll call it opposing methods or different methods when you go to different gyms, it's important because it allows you to interrogate your own bias, to challenge yourself, to say, well, actually, maybe I should be doing this differently.
Yeah.
And so that was the beauty of me doing that so young.
Yeah. And last question before we kind of get into our topics
Yeah.
is, what did you see both in Woga and at Gage that make them so consistent at having athletes at the national or Olympic level? It seems like for decades they are consistently producing athletes that are there. Where sometimes, you may have that athlete that is at that caliber at your club, and then that might be the one opportunity you get. But to consistently be producing athletes that still are making it, every time I look at Al Fong, I feel like he's had an athlete for decades at that level, and from what you experience, what are some of those things that make it to where they're able to consistently compete at the highest level?
Yeah, and you're right, and both Al, and of course his wife, incredible coach, Armane as well, together as a team. You're quite right in saying they have produced over and over again. I think that there's many things that contribute to this, but part of it is having a system, a replicable system, and this only can come through experience. But they know their model, and so they just repeat the model, and they continue to evolve it still. But they've got such clarity, and this is probably the most important point in both gyms there, or any successful gym around the world, whether it's Gage, Woga, or somewhere else. They will have absolute clarity on exactly what they're looking for from a technical perspective, a physical perspective, what the structure of the week needs to look like. And so once you've got that clarity, you're able to enforce that through high standards. You're able to hopefully create a system which allows that to be replicated over and over again with all the different generations that come through. And it just needs fine tuning and natural evolution. Where I guess younger programs or less experienced coaches might fall short is that they don't have that clarity yet. So that, their experience is of course just not as strong. And when you've got less conviction, you start to kind of move around between different ideas and concepts, and that can really slow you down, I think, in the journey of coaching. Um, and so clarity is mastery. That's just or clarity precedes mastery. You need that first before you can actually master anything.
No, and I think that's right on, because even for myself, like being, I guess, younger to um, club the club level of coaching. I'm going to my sixth season. I've been coaching since 2009, but I've coached high school gymnastics, which is kind of similar to anywhere from like Excel program to if you know the US Excel program
Yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
to like anywhere from level, you know, 6 through 9. That's typically the there's very rare where you have like level 10s that at where I was coaching in Minnesota. And so my experience was um I guess limited to really high level. I started really seeing high level gymnasts either through some of the opportunities got to work with former club kids when I was coaching high school gymnastics, and or when I had some college opportunities, and then getting into club, starting to learn a little bit more. And then, I still want to get to the place where am traveling and learning and getting around some of these coaches and really kind of learning these techniques. But like you said, having that clarity is hard, right? To really
Yeah.
understand how to develop and create your own system. And that's kind of where I am in my own journey, is how do I create a system that is um, it's easy to kind of adjust, based off of either the times or based off of the particular athlete, but yet have a structure that you can
Mhm.
kind of see in development. Which one of the things, kind of leading into what we're talking about, that I see is just running techniques in general. Um, I'm a huge component believer that the component of the run makes majority of the vault, and the one mistake that I've seen in some coaches is um, teaching the run for aesthetics rather than teaching the run for the function of
Mm,
developing power and speed to get an effective vault. And I feel like an athlete who could be fast and may not be super technical on vault can get to a certain place and could do a pretty decent vault. They could probably get to a layout, maybe a Yurchenko full, just based off of having mechanics of speed and understanding how to translate that at least into the springboard. But I feel like it's harder for an athlete who may not have speed to be able to get to a certain level of vault. They're going to plateau just because they won't have enough power to really continue the chain as they go, because we want the power to be able to translate and transfer into the next phases. But again, if there isn't enough power to start with, then it's hard to really be able to create more. And I feel like sometimes if you're not powerful, some of the technique things like shape changes to create even more power is going to be harder just because there may not be quick twitch in general. And
mm.
so I want to discuss how important, and at least from your perspective, the run is in developing athletes at any level.
Yeah. Well, it's an area that I, like yourself, really believe is very important, and think that we've got probably a real opportunity within gymnastics to improve what we deliver in this area as coaches, to the gymnasts. Um, I think there's a lot of context involved here. There's a threshold of how important running is, um, depending on the athlete. So, for some, they are naturally quick, and therefore, whilst it's going to be beneficial to teach them great technique, there might be a threshold of how much better their vault will become early on in their journey, whereas later on in their journey, you'll really see the difference. Okay, so there's some athletes that will get to a double twisting Yurchenko with actually quite a mechanically poor run, and you think, well, how does that work? Well, they're quick, so actually the technique doesn't have to be great because they're still fast. Now we can talk. Okay, you can make that more efficient. There can be more energy conservation for them. They could be more confident if they have a better cadence. All of that stuff is true, but I think the reason why so few coaches really work on the vault from a technical perspective is because most of the time they don't think they need to. It's like, well, my kid can do a double twist or a full twist, so like, why do I need to look at the run? And so there is a threshold, I think, there. Um, my I would probably go as far as saying when I first go to a nation to work with a team on vault, and I've done this for, well, quite a few nations now, the run is probably the first thing that I tend to address and look at, because as you quite rightly said, it's impacting and influencing the rest of the vault itself. So whether that's a Yurchenko or front entry vault, um, it's always my starting point because it has a knock-on effect, like a domino effect for everything else that is going to occur afterwards. So, if they're too close to the springboard, then it's difficult for them to get their springboard angle correct. Then that's going to have an impact on the way they block the vault. Or maybe it's not an efficient run, so therefore the transfer of energy is not smooth, and they lose energy into the atmosphere or the springboard. So yeah, I often focus on the run before I look at anything else. But running is a skill in itself, and there's already so many other things on vault to be worrying about. And it just comes down to the usual question of like, how much time do coaches have, and what's the smartest way of integrating great running into their program? And for me, it has to be a proactive approach. It has to be taught like you would teach a handstand. There's drills, there's preparations, there's ways of making it great as well as good. There's always a next level. And the only way of doing that is to, yeah, integrate it, weekly, specifically into the session itself. Now, I do feel that in recent years, and I would imagine this is as a result of social media and people seeing different drills, I think more coaches are trying to do more running work. But the problem is, what I see is that they'll do the drills and then they'll vault entirely differently. And there isn't that transfer and that connection of the dots between them. So you might have a coach leading a very deliberate session on running drills, maybe it's the warm up. They'll do their scissors, they'll do their wickets, they'll do their A skips, they'll do all of that kind of stuff. And maybe it's okay. It's not world class. It's not terrible, but actually, the athletes are trying to do the right thing. They're staying stiff, they're flexing their feet, they've got active knees. Cool. Well, that's good. But then when you watch them actually vault, you don't see any of that being transferred at all. And I think that as a general rule, most clubs and coaches now need to be thinking about what are they actually trying to transfer over. It's that bit in the middle where they've got to connect the dots now between all that preparation work that they might be doing, which, okay, could be more, but they're already doing it, and actually seeing that high knees run on vault, seeing the flexed foot, seeing the stiff ankle on contact with the floor. Otherwise, we could argue that all the drills and the preparation time is kind of wasted. It might be helping the athlete physically to an extent, but if they're not going to be able to demonstrate that in their technical performance, then it's just time lost. And I think that's the stage that most clubs are at that have kind of dabbled with running drills already. And of course, for those that it's a whole new world, well, they've probably got a really good opportunity to teach effective running. And I think like a handstand impacts so many skills in gymnastics. And it's not just because it's technically required, but you kind of teach them how to extend of the upper body. So how to, elevate the shoulders. You're teaching how to pull the ribs in. You're teaching them balance and capacity of body weight, of course. You teach pelvic tilt and control. So there's a lot of benefits that comes from learning a handstand, and we get the same thing like learning how to run. We get plyometric benefit, we get postural stuff, we get hip stiffness, we get understanding of acceleration, force production. There's so many other benefits to actually like the technical aspect of the run that it's still worth doing. And it just carries a lot of weight. So we share the same vision. Running's important. It should be taught as high a level as we can, and it does make a difference.
And also for, lower levels, at least in the US, one of this, you'll notice probably when they're starting off, like as pre-team or level 1, level 2, we're talking about now the developmental, formerly the Junior Olympics program, that, sometimes younger kids just have that natural, just like quickness to run, and they can have if they learn the technique of a good handstand, they can translate into a good handstand, right? But then you start to see as they get into maybe level 5, 6, 7, and then it really shows up in level 8, where their vault is. And one of the things that I feel like, because level 8 is the first time they can really do a flipping vault and land it to hard. Well, do a flipping vault and land it to hard here.
Yeah.
And so when doing so, it becomes one of those things where it becomes nerve-wracking, because you'll see either a lot more coaches near the table, saving athletes and stuff like that, because again, the level, that's one of the requirements, is trying to get a flipping vault, right? And so trying to pursue that, it becomes nerve-wracking, because there's maybe it could be the technical side of the entry and all that stuff, but it's also maybe because there isn't the development of run. And a lot of it is really because there is probably, a lot a lot of people that we see that can vault really well and have that natural speed or have understanding of technique, but the ones who may not, and you get to that level 8 time frame, and now your run really, really matters, because you have to develop all the proper things, like we talked about, the stiffness in your body, stiffness in your hips, your ankles,
Mm.
but even, being able to have good tension when you hit the board, hit the table, and then to have enough capacity to absorb all that you produced and to land on it. And which I think a lot of running techniques, develop some of those things without necessarily having to do like a conditioning, or even just the conditioning that you would do and the power development that you would do would train a lot of those things, um,
Mm.
and so really helping that kind of mid-level, like the level 8, and level 8 to level, down to level 5 area. That's kind of the area that I see a lot of times, right? Um, but even how we mentioned, like getting to a Yurchenko double full without having, you know, I guess proper running technique if you're thinking about running in a more track, mind frame.
Yeah.
So can you kind of talk about, your approach with those levels, that level 5 through level 8, so that when they get to level 8, they can, you know, produce a safe flipping vault where, coaches can feel a little bit more comfortable knowing, hey, you know what, this athlete can make this vault and make it safely and not feel the pressure of like, oh, this could be something very risky for them.
Yeah. And you said the word comfortable there. Like, is the coach going to feel comfortable? I mean, that's essentially, are they confident that their athlete can perform that? And I think the confidence again comes from the clarity and the systems that we talked about before. So, um, good runners will know how many steps they take. They'll know where they start. They know what leg they step forwards with, and they've got all of that information that they can access. And the coach is going to know that as well. So take these athletes, these young kids, they might not even be, really an athlete yet. They're just young kids, take them to a competition and you put them on a vault run, which is outside of their, typical environment that they're used to working on. Um, they can figure their run out. They know how many steps they're taking. They know which leg goes forwards first. They know what part of the tape measure they're going to start at, and they can replicate that. So I think one of the best things that we can do for young gymnasts is to work on again that clarity. This is your starting point. This sets you up for success. So you're able to commit to this run because it's replicable every time. And for whatever reason, if you're not able to repeat it, you're able to kind of adapt that when you go to a different environment. And I'll give you an example. This probably doesn't happen much with the youngest of children, but it certainly does at international level. That you might find that the surface you're running on is quite a springy surface. So actually, you're covering more ground through each step. Now, if that happens, you might need to adjust just to move back ever so slightly, but you're still using your starting point and you're still stepping forwards with the same leg first. So you just tweak it back until you get your sweet spot right. Particularly this is the case for athletes at international level that will compete on a podium, because competing on a raised podium is going to feel entirely different than running on a kind of a sports hall kind of environment with just a rolled out vault mat. So very, very different. But also athletes have fast days and slow days when their legs just might not be firing as much. It happens to all of them. They might need to just make those micro adjustments, but you've got your default starting place and you know all the other information to allow you to do that. So, there's a bit of work there about let's figure out for this particular gymnast exactly where they need to start and how many steps they take that sets them up for success. And you've got to have patience with that because it can take a couple of sessions just to get the run right. And athletes get frustrated. Coaches often get frustrated because they'll just see the kids running out going, no, my steps aren't right. My steps aren't right. And it's so easy to just go, you know what, forget it. Just start where you normally would. And now you're just going to have the same old vault, right?
Yeah.
And I think part of my process, certainly when I'm working with athletes on this, is just to be like, just so you know, this is going to be a bit hit and miss. You're going to get this wrong more than you're going to get this right over the next couple of sessions, and that's absolutely normal. Don't get frustrated because this is work that's really worthwhile. And this time next week, you're going to have such an outstanding run that you're confident in. It's going to take your vault to the next level. But I need you to understand that the next couple of sessions, it's probably going to feel frustrating, but it's normal. So what we're doing is priming that session to just, allow them that freedom to fail,
Yeah.
allow them, make the mistake and don't be disheartened because we're following a process here until we can figure out exactly where you want to be starting from. And, I've done this at the highest of levels. I mean, there's an athlete in the last sort of 6 months that I've done this with that already vaults and makes world finals. And I've completely changed the approach to running there. And this isn't just something that happens with a level 5. It happens at every stage. If you're looking at that vault and it just doesn't seem right, if if you close your eyes and you listen to the rhythm and it's not right, these are all things that you need to do. You're going to change that. You
Yeah.
make those adjustments. So that's pretty much what I'll be doing with those younger gymnasts. Um, Now, from a very technical perspective, I guess what I'm trying to teach them is posture. So let's get them completely upright. And there's a variety of drills that we're going to use in order to help them understand rhythm and hip stiffness and all of those things. But irrespective of what drill, everything from the waist up is going to stay still. So there's no leaning forwards, there's no leaning backwards, there's no changes to the rib and the hip position. It's always going to stay, let's call it neutral. And now any changes that we make on the drills is going to happen from the waist down. So that's like our scissor actions, our hops, our A skips, and all of the different variations that, there's an abundance of exercises out there. That all happens from the waist down. So we've got to teach them upright posture, first of all. That's my first priority. I guess my second priority is going to be specifically what is happening around the ankle. And you mentioned at the beginning about a lot of coaches are teaching run from an aesthetic perspective over function, which is completely, I'm not even going to say it's the wrong way around. Like, we don't need aesthetics with run, we only need function. We just need it to do the job, which is to deliver a great amount of energy to convert into a great vault. So,
Yeah.
to my knowledge, no one's judged on a run, or they certainly aren't in the UK, and they certainly aren't at international level. The judging happens with the vault itself. And so the aesthetics can go out the window. And I guess when we talk about aesthetics, I'm assuming here you're talking about like high ankles, a toe point still when they're running, the arms doing a very kind of natural, or sorry, unnatural robotic movement. And so, that ankle site, if you're running on the toes, you're just leaking energy into the floor. And it's one analogy that I often will make with the athletes themselves is imagine kind of walking in high heels and feel how unstable that is. And that's kind of what's taking place as the athlete's running down the vault run. The higher the ankle, the less energy they're able to apply into the floor, or force, I should say, less force they can apply into the floor. And because they're applying less force, they're getting less force out of the floor as what we call the resultant force. So we apply a force and we have a resultant force that works against it. So a flexed foot, a stiff ankle, is able to cope, tolerate, and apply more force, which is much better for running. But also on the way out of the floor, by having a very kind of flexed foot position, so a toes up position, that's going to promote the knee to rise as well. And so there we get a much better setup for the next step. And so those are probably the two most important things that I'm looking for even early on. So irrespective of age, irrespective of level, I want to see great posture and I want to see a flexed, stiff ankle on contact with the floor. And that's not to say that it's a flat foot because it's on the ball of the foot, but
Yeah.
it's still in a very strong, stiff position. And then all the drills that I use have basically got to promote those two things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, the one argument I've heard sometimes, even with that, is teaching athletes how to translate when to use what part of the ankles that they're, because a lot of floor, even though it's more natural in what happens, like when you're tumbling, your ankle's gonna drop. That's just part of the technique of it, right? But say you're gonna go into a leap pass or anything like that, you're trying to push through your toes and point your toes, and so, you know, I think some of the argument that people have is because almost in every other area you're teaching them to point their feet. So are they going to be able to know how to, or is it worth teaching them how to dorsiflex their foot in order to have that proper angle on vault? And if you've had that question, how have you addressed that with athletes and or coaches?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've come across much resistance. Of probably some coaches, it's just a paradigm shift. It's like something so totally different for them because they either assumed or have been watching other gymnasts kind of run on their toes. Because like you've said, that happens everywhere else. So why would we do something different when it comes to running? Um, the the counter to it is if it's not necessarily that the heel is down, the heel will be down on contact with the floor. It's where the weight distribution is, for example. So the even on back tumbling, the heel will contact the floor because the floor is going to compress, right? It doesn't stay rigid, but the weight is still towards the front of the foot. It's not towards the back of the foot, or I should say, it's front to midfoot rather than back foot.
Yeah.
And that's why when we're going through that range of motion, they need to be so strong in both plantar flexion and dorsiflexion to cope with the different forces that are being applied at all different ranges.
Yeah.
So that would be that. And the next thing is we get good at whatever we spend, or the athletes get good at whatever they spend quality time on.
Yeah.
So yes, there could be confusion. Yes, there could be athletes that don't understand when to point, when to flex, etc. But that's only as a result of the teaching process.
Yeah.
Now, if you take a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old that comes into the gym and it's like, right, we're on vault. What do we do with our ankles? And they all go, we flex our feet. And they do all their drills with flexed feet. And they do that throughout all their different levels. Then that is all they're going to know.
Yeah.
And when you go to beam and you start talking about, right, what do we do with our ankles here? And they always point their toes on beam, then that is how they're going to learn because that's the environment and the system that they're brought up in.
Yeah.
And so I think it just comes again down to clarity. We're on vault. This is what we do on vault, and this is what you've always known. And now we're on beam. It's a little bit different
Yeah.
because maybe the aesthetic is more important on beam from an overall presentation perspective. And
Yeah.
actually, we're not talking about running here and force production. They need to do like 2 steps max into a roundoff on the beam. So we don't need to worry about that there.
Yeah.
So I just think it's about having clarity and doing a very good job at being deliberate with the technique. And of course, this is a very important coaching concept. It's purposeful practice and deliberate technique, but it all comes down to clarity.
Yeah.
So if you give me an 8-year-old, I know exactly what I want. It is
Yeah.
there's no confusion. In my mind, I know what I want to see at 8 years old. And when they're 18, I also know what I want to see.
Yeah.
There's no confusion. And because of that, the athlete's not confused. They hear the confidence and the conviction in the words that I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it really comes down to like, does the coach understand here, like what exactly is expected of the athlete and why? That's the important thing.
Yeah.
And sorry, just finally on this, I think that we've always got areas that we can kind of flex on and bend in our approach to gymnastics.
Yeah.
Like not every athlete will do things the same,
Right.
but experience will help us to understand where we can not cut corners, but we can just basically take a different path.
Yeah.
And maybe answering one of your previous questions, you mentioned that yourself, you're trying to establish that system. What I think is one of the best things to do is to follow one method first and then adapt from there.
Yeah.
Because when you are either receiving mentorship from too many people or you use too many different forms of content to try and get an education, what you're doing is exposing yourself to too many different types of ways of doing things. Now you're just confusing yourself.
Right.
You would be better off, and I'm speaking not just to you here, I'm speaking to everybody that's listening. As
Yeah.
a coach, we're better off learning one model, learning one system in its entirety, like really understanding all the ins and outs of it, and then going elsewhere and going, right, now I'm able to kind of um, look for new horizons. I'm going to look for a new model now, which maybe challenges the existing one that I've already got a lot of clarity on.
Yeah.
That I feel is different than trying to absorb 6 different systems at the same time and never forming any conviction in any one approach.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that. And one of the kind of going back to even just talking with vault is the hurdle lines. Some people use a hurdle line or like a tape and stuff like that,
Yeah.
and having even just a conviction on that. Because, like, if I, personally, in my own belief, I think internally, the athletes a lot of times can um, decipher when they are approaching the table and they either slow down or they stop because they either feel that they're too far or too close and they can't hit. And so I don't necessarily like to use the hurdle line for them because sometimes it puts their eyes down and they haven't really learned to, even though we do a lot of air awareness stuff in general in gymnastics, they haven't really learned to do that. And all of a sudden they're looking down to hit it and then they look up and they're hurdling, or
Mm,
to do their vault either into a round off, and then they're not focusing on, hey, I'm approaching this table as hard or as fast as I can or properly as possible to be able to translate this energy into a proper vault. And now they're running, 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 and if they don't hit it, even if their run was correct or smooth, they stop. And so just even, can you talk about the your thought processes on that, and if it is used, should it be used for the athletes or for the coaches to kind of be able to say, hey, this is where they're at based off of where they're starting that default start spot, so hey, this vault should be predictable.
yeah, yeah. So in full transparency, I've never used a hurdle line ever in the time that I've coached. And none of the athletes that I've ever coached have used a hurdle line. I don't think I've seen anyone in the UK use a hurdle line, certainly within my own kind of realm. And now that's not to say that we're doing things better. It's just to say I think it might be a cultural thing within certain nations as a this is how we do things. But I am yet to see or understand of a compelling reason for me to change that approach. I think that a hurdle line, as you've mentioned, I think we're probably in agreement here, is a bit distracting because the athlete is they're thinking about a fixed reference on the floor as being their measure of success about whether they're in the right place or not. I don't want them to think about that. I want them to think something else about like, was the first step correct? Am I accelerating early enough? Is my cadence correct? So all of those things will set the athlete up to be in the right spot. So the hurdle line is irrelevant. That it's okay. Um, you would have to essentially be moving that around too much for it to be of any use. Because ultimately, I know you mentioned it being maybe a default, which is fair, but um, I just don't understand what feedback that's useful for, that the run itself and the intuitiveness of knowing the steps, knowing the approach, knowing the starting point is not gonna offer. I get much more from that. And I don't want that bit of tape to be distracting. I think that will be distracting for me as a coach as well,
Yeah.
to measure any kind of form of success on that vault as if they're in the right place or not. And while we're on that topic, what I'm using is sound. So I want to listen, like the sound of the run will tell you so much about it. And I get athletes to do this as well. So again, I can think of in the last few months at very high level, having two athletes that I was working on their runs together. One would stand next to me whilst I was coaching and would close their eyes and listen to their teammate do the run. And I would simply ask them, what did you hear when you listened to that vault? And they might say there was a short step, or they slowed down, or it was too quick at the end in terms of the turnover, not in terms of velocity, but their legs are moving too quickly for the amount of kind of horizontal velocity that's there. And when you start helping athletes to understand that, I find that personally to be really powerful. That's the kind of feedback I want from them. It's like, where's the pattern? What does this sound like? That's feedback that's useful. Whereas the fixed object on the floor, it's for me, it's not useful in that approach. But that's just my perspective, and I'm sure there'll be some highly successful coaches that have probably got more experience than me that use a hurdle line, they swear by it, and it's a really embedded part of their process. But of course, I can only share my experience.
Yeah, because I know in track and field there's like pole vault. I did pole vault in high school and in university, and that was one of the concepts that were taught. So you kind of know where your plant would be, and so the coach will kind of know when you're doing like jumping events, like if you're doing triple jump or long jump, you kind of have like your hurdle line, especially in triple jump. You have that platform you have to hit, right, and know when you're going to hit it and hit it with as much velocity as you possibly can to be able to continue your jump. And
Yeah.
so that's where I personally feel like that might have gotten adopted from, is from that area of track and field. But in my experience, I just, as you said, I find it to be a little bit more distracting. But one thing that you did talk about too is even, in the cadence, excuse me, is in the cadence, right? So if I had, say, the exact same athlete, say I had an athlete who's 5'1", and we're gonna do a front entry vault a back entry vault and say a side like a Suk or a Kaz, um, are you going to approach the run different for all three vaults, or is it going to pretty much stay the same, and or will you keep the default start position the same for all three of those vaults?
Mm.
And can you kind of talk about that? Because and I know there's going to be differences because athletes having either longer legs compared to their torso, or being taller, shorter, having a longer torso, shorter legs. So there's that variation that will dictate it. But say on
Yeah.
average, if you were just talking about one athlete with three different vaults, what would be your approach and how they um their approach to their run for each of those vaults?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I would put them into two categories rather than three. I would say that you've either got a front or a back entry. So the cars, the Suk, I would just put that in the same box as a front handspring, for example. So all of those I would treat the same, and then of course your Chenko or your Chenko half on, I would approach slightly differently. Now, actually, the run itself is, in terms of technically, there's no change. They start in the same style. The cadence is the same. There's nothing that needs to change there necessarily, apart from where they're starting. And as a very general rule, we want to use as much of the vault run as possible. So you're going to find that because you've got the hurdle for your Chenko, the skip up stage, which you might refer to it as, you're going to need to start, or you're going to have less steps because you've got to account for the fact that there's a longer hurdle in there. So we often find, on average, that a front entry vault, gymnasts are somewhere around the 13 steps kind of mark for most gymnasts. Whereas Iachenko, they're usually like 2 steps less than that. They'll be around 11. And so I just want to use as much of the vault run as possible. Now, depending on how good they are at running or how slow they are, whatever, depends on really how many steps you can actually fit in. Some incredible vaulters, they will struggle. Well, they won't do 13 steps because they're covering so much ground as they're accelerating that they just can't fit that many in. And so it's always that balance between, do I take a step out, or do I need to take 2 steps out because they want to start on the same leg, or to move them backwards, forwards? And it's, it can get a bit not messy. You just need to have, again, conviction and be open to experimenting and understanding what the right thing is for that particular athlete. But as a general rule, use as much of the vault run as possible. And there's probably going to be 2 extra steps in a front entry vault. Now, it is worth noting that it's not always the fastest run which produces the best vault. Okay, and this is the threshold that I was referring to before. So um, it's not always optimal to go as quick as possible. And so that's particularly important, I think, for your Chenko vaults for most athletes, is that the faster they go, actually, the harder it might be for them to control that energy and to get like an optimal block off the table. Whereas for front entry vaults, usually they feel a lot more comfortable to attack that and to maintain that acceleration all the way to the springboard. So, it's not unusual for athletes to not run at full speed, but that doesn't mean that they're not running with optimal technique. And that's the difference, right? We're not talking about sloppy technique and low speed here. We're talking about great technique, which conserves energy, which sets the athlete up for success on the springboard and allows them to produce whatever technically they need to do in the air. That's the important thing here. So I guess I'm going on this tangent because you often find that a front entry vault, you get them going a bit quicker. They need to accelerate more versus Yurchenko vault. It's because the body, I think, because the posterior chain is that bit stronger in that action of um, let's say driving back to the table. We've got all the back muscles, which are really, really strong. It just makes it a bit easier to be able to perform that Yurchenko at less velocity. Whereas a front entry vault, you're having to really use more of the anterior chain in terms of like blocking off the table, applying pressure in. Gymnasts don't tend to be as strong in that area, you see. They're going to need all the speed and power they can get to get their body upside down, to get the hip upside down to perform whatever front vault they might be doing.
And do you feel like on floor the run is is really a factor in regards to how to produce enough power, or is it really the development of the hurdle going into, if it's a round off or if it's a front handspring or if it's a punching, skill going forward? How much does a run influence the floor in regards to tumbling?
Yeah, so it's going to be that horrible answer of it depends again, because there's that threshold depending on which athlete you're working with. So you might have a fast twitch athlete that can kind of effortlessly accelerate 2 to 3 steps, which let's be honest, that's the most they're going to be doing is certainly at senior level is 2 or 3 steps into a tumbling pass. And therefore, how the run looks probably not very important to a certain extent. The hurdles not that important for those athletes because they're
Mm.
strong enough to turn over the round off or to turn over the front handspring without it being technically that great. Now, that's not to say that it's not important, and that's not to say there aren't gains that can be made or it can't be more effective, but you just often find that things that matter to little kids that are trying to do big skills is quite different to older, stronger, experienced athletes that are trying to do those same skills. So it's just there's just a threshold here. But for consistency, we should just teach the run still to be just as good on the floor. We should teach the hurdle to be just as accurate because that's part of the system that we want. This is the way we hurdle when we do acrobatics. This is the way that we run and accelerate. It's all part of one family. And that's the easiest, most efficient way of teaching because then everything that you do on vault is going to transfer over to floor and vice versa.
Yeah.
Um, with your 9-year-olds and your 10-year-olds, I guess what I was trying to say was if they run poorly, then they're going to struggle to do a decent hurdle into a round off or a front handspring. And if the round off's poor as well, then they're not going to be able to do much at all. So those little hacks, I guess, or those details really matter to younger children. And it might be the reason why they succeed or they get to the next level in their gymnastics or not.
Yeah.
And again, this is the threshold. This is why for a let's say we look at top international gymnasts, you can look at a lot of them and say, well, they don't run great, but they're doing a Yurchenko double. It's not great technique. The feet aren't particularly flexed. The recovery of the leg is slow. It's lifting up really high and loads of strain on the hamstring. You can say all these things, but you're looking at the gymnasts that have made it to international level. They're the outliers already. They're
Hmm.
already they're fantastic gymnasts. They're fantastic athletes.
Yeah.
Running is one part of their gymnastics, which makes them great. And
Yeah.
so, okay, if they're not particularly great runners, cool. They're probably very, very strong. They might be fast still. They might be very stiff. Okay. Now, what we're seeing is the gymnasts that make it. Well, what about the ones that don't? Let's look at their running. Let's look at
Right.
their hurdles. Let's look at how stiff they are on contact. That's the question that we should be asking.
Yes.
Not looking at the ones that make it and go, well, they don't do this. They don't need to. Well,
Yes.
cool. There's plenty of gymnasts that do need it, and that's what's stopping them from progressing. And that's what I think is really important that we
Yeah.
look at as coaches.
No, and I agree. And that's kind of the conversation I want to have with the community, gymnastics community, is to be able to help the ones that are non-outliers, right? If we're talking about the statistics of it,
Yeah.
majority of them are going to fall into what we do not see. But that's what we have to deal with every single day, right? And but sometimes because we may have opportunities to have those outliers, occasionally, it may allow us to negate teaching some of these things just because you have those kids who just naturally can do it. So you can just say, hey, do what they're doing, but not really understanding what they're really doing and teaching what they're doing, and some of it may not be something you necessarily want to teach in regards to technique wise, just because they may not be technical. And if that athlete try to do what they're doing, it would just probably hurt them more. But to be like, all right, you know what? I know for these athletes, I have to teach this. And, for this athlete, again, I have to pick and choose my battle. And this is not one that is worthwhile because they're able to do what I need them to do at the end of the day in regards to that event well enough to where it isn't a major factor in it. And it's not going to, spending the time is not going to really add enough value to be worthwhile, right?
Yeah.
Um, But also in American football, one of the things you kind of mentioned earlier on vault is in your approach that you don't always need speed, but want to be technical. So in American football, like on a receiver or even just like a running back, they talk about how your route running or your timing of what you do is important. And what makes a great receiver who's a great route runner is how they set up each like route. It's not how fast they can do it because again, the quarterback is doing something too. There's a timing to how they are releasing. So say they take the football, they're doing a 3-step drop into a designed route, and this is where you're supposed to be. This is where I'm throwing it to, and this is where you need to be. If the quarterback does that, takes the ball, 1, 2, 3, throws it in the spot, and you overrun it, you're not going to be there. Now you make them look back because you ran it too fast, right? And the ones who can understand, okay, how the concept of what we're trying to do and the timing of how to develop it. And yes, you have obviously the factor of having a defender and stuff like that, playing into it, but still you need to get to where you need to get to on time, right? And in ball or even in floor tumbling, you're trying to get to where you're trying to get to on time and keeping that balance between what you said, a technical aspect of approaching it, but as well as the speed that you need to do it in order to achieve that, right? And so having that understanding and the word that you use that I love is clarity on that. I think is really important to really kind of teach coaches and understand like what you're really trying to get and to teach it in concepts, not necessarily to teach it as um just like, okay, this is, I need you to learn all these things, but okay, this is the concept of what we're doing and this is how we're going to translate the concept into floor or vault or whatever it is.
Absolutely. And I teach 4 principles of acrobatic development, which all start with S. We've got shape, speed, stiffness, and sight. And for those are my concepts. They are my priorities really when you're teaching skills. And I think, again, that forms part of my system, which then allows that to be consistent across all apparatus. So you are teaching the same message over and over again, as opposed to thousands of different messages a few times. And that's is going to accelerate understanding and transfer. So that stiffness in the hip when a gymnast is applying pressure as they're running is going to be very similar to the stiffness of the hip when they're contacting a beam in a round off straight salto dismount, like you call that a back layout. It's also the same hip stiffness we would look to see if they were doing a loaded step up in the weights gym. It's the same if they were doing a plyometric rebound. It's the same when they contact the springboard. So stiffness is a concept, as you've just said. It's a principle, and we've got to get clarity on where they are.
Yeah.
And I think that really helps with transfer over. But yeah, I agree with what you said, and we must just draw on that point that top speed is not what we're looking for. It's optimal speed, but it's nice that the athlete's got a bit more in reserve if they ever need it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking about that. And I'm excited for hopefully in the future for us to kind of do more of these. And this was just one area we kind of really just talked about just running and how it applies to vault and a little bit on floor and kind of, finding different areas and stuff like that to kind of have these conversations. And hopefully these are, helpful things. And also to, for you to kind of talk about, as we wrap this up, where can people find you, find your master class, or you being located in the UK, do you still do much in the US? If there's clinics or anything like that, I know you do some stuff with Dave Tilley and the and what he has going on. And so, can you kind of tell the viewers, the listeners, how can they, if they want to learn more, and if that's they're either at the area where they have, a style or a technique that a concept that they've really developed and need something
Mm,
else to kind of challenge that, or if they're looking for something to be able to start to have a system to be
yeah.
able to learn, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity there. So nickruddock.com is the easiest place to find me. So that's NICKRUDDOCK. And my Instagram handle is the same. It's simply Nick Ruddock. That's where I'm most active on social media. And for coaches that are just looking for that next step, probably, or they're looking for a mentor, someone that can support them, my community, which is the Gymnastics Growth Academy, is probably the best way of tapping into that. And we've got a community of coaches from 59 countries now, courses in their exercise library, over 85 hours of masterclass content. And yeah, I'm in there live streaming weekly, talking about all of these concepts and more. So that's the Gymnastics Growth Academy, but you'll be able to find out information on that via nickruddock.com.
And do you have any last things you kind of want to leave the listeners and viewers just in kind of related to our conversation, or just in general, that you want them to kind of get from
Mm.
you as a little nugget for them to be able to add to their own journey as a coach, as a person, to their athletes?
Yeah, well, great question. I would just say stay really curious and keep challenging your own beliefs. That takes an element of self-awareness and reflection. But I think that's probably one of the most powerful skills that you can have as a coach is to first understand there's a wide world of gymnastics and there's so many different ways of doing things. And not to fall in love with your own beliefs. And if you're only exposing yourself to people and environments that think the way that you do, you're probably limiting your own way of thinking and your coaching potential. So just make sure that you have conviction in what you do, but you're not so rigid with it that you won't look for other ways of evolving your own approach. And that starts with curiosity, self-awareness, and yeah, a nice bit of self-reflection in there as well. So that'll be my bit of advice.
Well, thank you again, Nick, for being on and taking time out of your day to kind of have this conversation. And hopefully, this is valuable information for anybody else who are kind of in the same boat. And hopefully, people reach out, or people tune into your website and check out the resources that you have to be able to add to their already the knowledge that they have to help them grow and to help their athletes. And so thank you again. And thank you everybody for tuning in to another episode of Heated Conversations. I will link all his information in the description below. But you can also just follow him on Instagram, as he said, at Nick Ruddock. And just like he spelled it out, and I'll also have that linked in the description below. Thank you again. Remember to subscribe, to share, to like, leave a comment, hit that notification bell. We'll see you guys on the next episode.